Produced by the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars since 1988, this program, Dialogue, has offered its audience informed discussion on important ideas and issues in national and international affairs, history, and culture. The program is the broadcast extension of the Wilson Center's mission to build a bridge between the worlds of ideas and public policy. For most of its 20-plus year history, Dialogue did so under the guidance of its founding host, George Seay, who left us and this program too soon when he passed away in May of 2009. We'll take a look back at his work and the program he built. This week on Dialogue, a retrospective, remembering George Liston Seay. Hello again and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Milewski. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. That's the phrase Dialogue host George Seay used to introduce the program each week. And whenever I speak those words, I hear his voice, and I'm reminded of just how high he set the bar for those of us that follow in his wake. Programs like this don't have large audiences by commercial broadcast measures, but those who watch are thoughtful and intelligent, and we know that you come here for something different than the noise and spectacle that dominates much of talk television, and that's what George delivered in his inimitable way. With the help of some of his former colleagues and program guests, we're going to revisit a selection of interviews that represent the spirit of Dialogue over the years. But first, we'll look at a segment from an interview I conducted on C-SPAN in 2001. It was a rare occasion when the master interviewer found himself in the guest chair. Let's take a look. Tell us about Dialogue. What's the subject matter of the program?
Well, that's actually a pretty complex question in a way, John. I was thinking about it, and it occurred to me that the Greeks in the classic times defined happiness as the use of vital forces along lines of excellence in a life affording them scope. And I think through Dialogue I found that in a very modest way, because Dialogue basically, in a few words, is a conversation about ideas. And I love ideas. I love language, and I love the men and women who create original ideas, who represent history, who interpret our times, and I think in the profoundest sense lead us through those ideas.
Now, the Woodrow Wilson Center is an austere Washington institution, scholarly in nature.
And yet a lot of fun, too.
And typically you don't see an institution of that nature having its own radio program.
Well, that's very true. That's very true. And I think that's one of our distinguishing characteristics. And I think that we have this program, John, the radio program, and increasingly are active in television, because we see scholarship as something that should be communicated, that shouldn't belong to the ivory tower. It belongs to everyone. There's no reason why a book produced by anyone shouldn't relate to everyone, or at least give everyone an equal chance of interpreting it. You should never write in jargon. You should never feel that you are creating something that's just for a kind of a sacred caste. So our mission, if you want to call it that, is to bring the world of scholarship, the world of public affairs, and the public itself into the discussion. And that's what I try to do in a modest weekly way with a radio program.
Our first guest is no stranger to this program. She was among the first I interviewed when I became George's successor last year. Haleh Esfandiari is the director of the Wilson Center's Middle East program and a frequent contributor to Dialogue. Haleh, welcome.
Thank you.
Talk to us about the first time you met George.
He was doing the radio program then, and I had just finished writing my book, my first book, which I finished at the Wilson Center. So he asked me to come over, and I went there. And I saw him for the first time, and we started talking, and it was love at first sight and friendship at first sight. And we became friends and stayed very good friends, and I was impressed by the depth of his knowledge, by his modesty, by his kindness. You know, you felt that you have a friend who is so knowledgeable, who is so good, so kind.
The best interview ever was a phrase that we heard from people who sat in the guest chair across from George, and not always love at first sight. Maybe it didn't go that far, but it was certainly the best. Talk to us about that, and there's a particular interview that you can set up the clip that we're going to show.
Yes. Over the years, I introduced a great number of people to George that I thought might be interesting for an interview. then I came to him one day and said, the former Queen of Iran is going to speak at the Wilson Center talking about her book, and she would make a very good subject. And he was very enthusiastic about it, and he started working on the book and also on Persian poetry and prose. And then when the Queen appeared for the interview, she was impressed by the knowledge, the breadth of knowledge that George had on Iran and on poetry and on Iranian literature, and they both were impressed with each other. And I thought that, to me, this was the best interview that I had seen that George had done.
Let's take a look, and then we'll come back and speak a little more.
You know, I was very proud of our history, of our cultures. And I knew that our country in centuries has given so much to the rest of the world, as well as we have taken from outside. In philosophy, in science, in beauty, in literature. Iran was always known the land of roses and nightingales.
That's right.
And I would say the land of 1001 poems of love.
Let me recite a poem then, because from reading this fine book and from other people that I've known from Iran and from Persia, I know the importance of poetry. And I would almost say that poetry is, for me, the lifeblood of Iranian culture and identity. So you have made me go and look up some Iranian poetry. And I went right to, I think, one of the great ones, the Epic of Shahnameh, the Book of Kings by Ferdowsi. And let me read this section. It's from the very opening section, because I think it's marvelous, and even in translation. And forgive any mispronunciation of mine. Kayumers first sat upon the throne of Persia and was the master of the world. He took up his abode in the mountains and clad himself and his people in tiger skins. And from him sprang all kindly nature and the arts of clothing, till then unknown. Men and beasts from all parts of the earth came to do him homage and receive laws at his hands, and his glory was like the sun. It's beautiful as poetry. It also suggests that for Iran, the Shahs had historically, from that time to your time, a kind of civilizing mission. Is this correct?
It is correct, and Ferdowsi for us is the symbol of Iranian identity, and the encourager of the good in human being and heroism.
Right.
And for all of our us Iranians, really, Ferdowsi is still living. He has always lived.
Okay, Hala, and after this interview, there was a sort of long-distance relationship, at least an appreciation that lasted.
But John, look at this interview, look at that segment, and see how at ease the two are with each other. I mean, they're talking to one another. It's not that Georgie is asking question and the former Queen of Iran is answering.
Right.
You know, and over the years, every time I saw the Queen, which was not many times, she always asked after George. And George also, he always said, make sure you say hello to the Queen if you see her. Of course, I didn't see her many times. But then when George passed away, the Queen wanted to write something to someone who was related to him, but, you know, there was no wife and no daughter or no child.
Well, you got to verbally deliver her note today.
Yeah.
Thanks. Our next guest is my co-host for the Quarterly Report feature. Steve Lagerfeld is the editor of the Wilson Center's flagship publication, the Wilson Quarterly. Steve, welcome back to Dialogue.
John, it's great to be here.
George was a big fan of the magazine.
Well, I was a great fan of George and his show, and it's great to have this opportunity to talk about him as a great interviewer, but also a great friend.
Now, do you think there's similarities between Dialogue and the magazine in that the things George talked about in the opening clip?
Well, except that one's done on tape and the other one's done on paper, there's hard to find a lot of differences. In fact, the spirit that inspires Dialogue also inspires the Wilson Quarterly, this idea of taking academic, scholarly work, serious, specialized work, and bringing it to a broader public, opening up that conversation is really essential to what both of us, and you and I, do.
Now, you're a print guy.
I am.
And George was a unique hybrid, a man who was clearly a person of paper, of books, of magazines, of
Always
literature.
had piles of them wherever he hung his hat.
Do you know anyone else who read as many books as George?
Maybe a book review editor would, but that's about it.
Yeah. But then he also could perform in this electronic medium. But he made it a little different. How did he do that? What about his style was very literary while doing television and radio?
Well, I think George was really driven by this great curiosity, number one, that was reflected in all those piles of books and other things that he was always going through. And he had this intense desire to communicate, to bring his own curiosity, his own discoveries to a lot of people. And I think that's really what animated this show when he did it, and still does.
We're going to take a look at a clip from one of the interviews that George did. And one of the concepts when we were discussing this program is this notion of taking the work of a public intellectual and making it accessible to a larger audience. You do it certainly with the Quarterly. George did it each week on Dialogue. Let's take a look.
It just dawned on me that, because this is a venerable phrase, balance of power, we grew up hearing that, but it may have very different meaning now. In other words, in the old days, the balance would be spheres of influence and these major dominant powers, often militarily, extending their domination and control of other places or economically. But now the empires have to respond to the empirees, if there is such a word.
That's very true. And I think that if people were to have a hierarchy of the rigidity of these terms, superpower would be the most rigid, empire would be a little bit less so. What the term I use is even more subtle, and that is centers of gravity throughout the book. I refer to them as areas that have a certain pull.
Right.
And the question is simply how strong is that pull in any given region. But it's less about hegemony than the traditional rhetoric or discussion about superpowers and empires is.
Give us a sense, Parag, if you will, of what I call modus operandi of these empires, because they too, we're talking about the second world, but the empires themselves have, I keep using the word strategies, but styles of projecting their power, manners of doing it. What's the distinction, briefly said, between how Europe does it, how China does it, how the U.S. has done it?
Well, I call it the 3 C's in the book. The U.S. has a coalition style of diplomacy, and everyone is familiar with the term coalition of the willing. The Europeans have a consensus style of diplomacy, as is evident from the way in which the European Union operates and how they attempt to build and expand outwards. And the Chinese have a consultative style of diplomacy, which is very familiar to Asia watchers who have looked at how ASEAN diplomacy has evolved and how China has used its sort of Confucian-inflected diplomacy to merge into that space ever more deeply. And the consultative pattern has become the approach that all countries have towards diplomacy within that Asian space, which is, of course, accounting now for half the world's population.
Exactly.
So this is hardly niche diplomacy.
One of the associations that I have when I see the clip is just the notion of the wide range of topics that you at the Quarterly need to deal with, that we at Dialogue need to deal with. In many ways, you and George sat in unique perches here.
Well, and we shared a lot of conversations over the years about just that sort of thing. We also talked about the many things we read and the people we encountered and shared a lot of ideas. One of the great things about this show is that you will see, in looking back over George's tenure, guests who were conservative, guests who were liberal, but you won't find any people who are ideologues per se. George just wasn't interested in controversy for controversy's sake. He was interested in people who had some serious things to say, that had a point of view that he could draw out and that we could all learn from.
Well, that's a legacy we're going to maintain. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Jim.
Our next guest is the director of the Wilson Center's Latin American program and also a frequent contributor to Dialogue. Cindy Arnson joins us. Cindy, welcome back.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here today for this special program for us, for all of us. One of the things that George talked to me about a lot off the air as friends was his Peace Corps experience and how that influenced his worldview and his choices after that point and really created an affinity for the region. Could you talk to us about that part of George, how George would immerse himself in another culture?
Well, it was really clear to all of us in the Latin American program that George had a special soft spot in his heart, particularly for Brazil, where he had been a Peace Corps volunteer, but I think for the entire region. And I think he loved the culture, he loved people, he loved the diversity, certainly in Brazil, of the racial composition of the country. And he always, I think, took a great deal of pride in having had an experience outside the United States that formed his view of what it was to live in a foreign country. And I think that he was able to bring that experience as an interviewer to the work that he did at Dialogue.
George was almost an embodiment of globalization even before we had the term.
That's very true, but I think what struck me most about George was his passionate interest in the subject that he was talking to someone about. He made someone feel like you were the most important person and your ideas were the most important that he had encountered in the recent past. And you know, he came to an interview completely informed and immersed in a book that had been written and some of the surrounding events, you know, that it touched on, and made you feel like you were really special and that you had written something of great importance. And he loved immersing himself in the ideas that you were trying to reflect.
We have another clip to take a look at, and this is another example of where George speaks to an academic, someone who's very expert in his field, and makes it accessible. So let's take a look, and then we'll come back and talk some more.
I think that this belief in the market, that the market would take care of poverty, that the market would take care of everything, did not work. So it's a rebellion against neoliberal policies, and in a way it's a return to the past in a very interesting way. The idea is that the state has a responsibility toward its citizens, and the responsibility is to provide jobs, to provide security, to provide medicine, to provide social services. Right. So in a way they want to sort of go back to neo-Keynesian economic policies of the 1960s and 70s, to nationalism. That's why to be confrontational to the United States is important, because they consider that the government were subservient before.
That's an excellent insight, Carlos. You know, and let me ask you, if I can take it one step further, does that also mean, or is that the reason why, they seem to emphasize so much the communal form of political activism? It seems to me what they really, the impression I get is they really mobilize public opinion as kind of the base of their use of power, and people act communally much more than perhaps individually in their conception of how to run things.
That's a very interesting point for a debate, and a debate that they have in these Andean nations. Many academics in these nations, and also U.S. academics, argue that indigenous people have a different way of not only of producing economic goods, but of creating communal solidarity and even forms of political rule that are based on the community.
Right.
Cindy, you mentioned going into the clip George's preparation, which is exhibited there. This was not purely an interview, it was a discussion. George could really interact with his guests in a meaningful way.
Absolutely. Carlos de la Torre was not coming to present a book that George would have been able to read in advance, but the questions that he asked and the way he brought out more background and deepened the discussion with Carlos, I think, is evident of his skill as an interviewer, really, to take a topic or a theme about which he is curious and push the person to the next step in explaining this to a broader audience.
Great. Thanks, Cindy.
Thank you.
Our final guest is the Wilson Center's Vice President for Programs and Director of International Security Studies, Robert Litwak. Hi, Rob. Welcome back.
Thank you.
I want to talk to you about the big picture of how dialogue relates to the Wilson Center's mission.
Dialogue is an extension of the Wilson Center's mission, serving as a bridge between the worlds of learning and public affairs. There are many shows that deal with current events, but what was distinctive about George's approach through the Dialogue program was to look at the ideas and the underlying assumptions that drove American policy.
And talk to us about how the scholars that you're part of the selection process of choosing and bringing here and working with fueled the pump, provided a lot of the guests that appeared on the program.
Well, George drew broadly from the resources of the center, including our residential fellows. But I think what is consistent in the approach is the role of history as a tool of policy analysis. And the Wilson Center is distinctive in bringing foreign perspectives to Washington and to the American public policy debate. And in that way, bringing to the public policy debate how peoples outside the United States view these policy issues and taking those views into account.
Now, I know you were a big supporter of George's work because when, you remember back when George and I and others from the Close-Up organization I worked with and this organization forged a partnership for an on-air program, you were one of the early supporters. What is it about electronic media that you think is so valuable to the mission?
The reach that it has potentially, and through the internet as well as through the broadcast. But I think, you know, although the media may change, the approach has been consistent, which is to view kind of what are the ideas, the underlying assumptions that have huge consequences in terms of policy outputs. And George was unique in his ability to kind of tease out what are those underlying assumptions and how can they become drivers of policy, and to anticipate what possible consequences could arise from that.
The clip we're going to look at, it features a Pulitzer Prize winner who worked on a book while here at the Wilson Center, David Sager.
Yes.
Let's take a look.
You know, we're in a second nuclear age, George, and in the second nuclear age, having the capability to build a bomb is as useful, maybe more useful, than having the bomb. Why do I say that? With the capability, you can stay inside the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and Iran is a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. In fact, there are only 3 countries that aren't: Israel, Pakistan, and India, and North Korea dropped out, but had been a signatory. The threat on Iran's part that they could drop out and throw out all the inspectors, and thus leave us even more blinded than we are today about the status of their program, is an enormously powerful threat.
Exactly.
So my personal belief, and I could be proved wrong here, is they don't necessarily need to put together a bomb. All they need to do is have a convincing design, a group of scientists who were fairly well convinced could build a weapon, and enough of a store of enriched uranium that in a few months everybody knows that they could improve its enrichment to bomb grade.
Right.
There are other countries that have that capability. Japan is one. We just don't worry about them. But do we doubt, given their technological prowess, the Japanese could build a bomb in a matter of months? Of course they could.
That's a given. You know, Afghanistan, which is the next country presented in this book, presents a very different range of problems, David. And it's quite interesting because, to sum it up, it seems to be the problems of what we might call alliance warfare, when conceptions of that warfare differ. I think you very, very directly point out that NATO and the U.S. forces are almost on different missions there, and they don't necessarily coincide. My shorthand for the whole mess, if you will, in Afghanistan, drawn from what you said, and including the Afghan government in the analysis, are that it's a tableau, an unholy tableau, where President Karzai is untrustworthy, NATO is uncertain, and the U.S. is unrealistic.
Right, and overstretched.
And overstretched. Now, if all that is true, or major portions of it at least, what's the key to unraveling the mess?
Rob, you've been in the guest seat on many programs and for print interviews over the years. What was different for you when being interviewed by George?
Well, I think George really focused on providing his viewers or listeners a context for looking at the contemporary debates. And I was interviewed by him. I knew him since 1983. We interviewed during the Cold War period, the post-Cold War period, and then the post-9/11 period. And in the clip you just showed, it addressed 2 issues, the nuclear issue and Afghanistan. And on the nuclear question, when George addressed the nuclear issue, he would look in a more profound underlying basis of the question. What is driving these programs? Why do countries feel they need nuclear weapons? What would be the reason why a country would feel it would need a nuclear weapon? Or in the case of Afghanistan, the challenge of state building, that Afghanistan is a country of nations, but it has weak state capacity. And how can the United States focus on building or promoting state capacity? Is that a realistic objective even? And in this way, elucidating the key big questions that underlie the public policy debate. And in that sense, it was really the depth and breadth of concerns that he brought, including foreign perspectives on issues that he brought to the debate through his programming.
And so much of what we do in this medium is throwaway. It's here today, gone tomorrow, but that context has lasting value.
Yes.
Thanks, Rob. Some final thoughts. In many ways, dialogue is the little engine that could. George created the program working out of a basement office of the Smithsonian, armed with only a tape recorder and a commitment to intelligent conversation. 22 years later, the program is syndicated on radio stations across the country, and thanks to MHZ, reaches more than 30 million television households in almost every state. Many people have contributed to this success, and one that must be mentioned is George's longtime collaborator, dialogue producer and technical director John Tyler. Thanks, John. But ultimately, all of us who work on the program remain inspired by George's vision and passion for the work. He knew, as I do, that what we do is a privilege and comes with a responsibility to you. George used to like to say, never take the person sitting next to you for granted. We're surrounded by remarkable people. Words to live by. So whether the person is sitting next to me here on the set or is joining us virtually, as you are on the other side of the camera, I can assure you that you won't be taken for granted on this program. This is the finale of our current broadcast cycle. We'll feature best of episodes for the next few weeks, and then return in the fall with all new dialogue interviews. But before we leave you for what we hope will be a happy and healthy summer, we want to share one final clip, and in so doing, give George the final word. Hope you enjoyed this look back. We thank you for watching, and I also want to mention that George wanted to reach the 1000th dialogue program. Now, that didn't happen physically. He wasn't in the host seat, but I can assure you when that 1000th program occurred, which it recently did, George was here. Here's a clip. You, in your bio, there's a quote from you talking about the lost art of conversation. Why is it lost? Why is it a lost art?
Well, simply put, and I don't mean to be facetious, people really don't talk anymore. I mean, I think that people chat, they exchange gossip, and I'm generalizing, of course, not you and me, but
of course not.
but I do
other people.
But I think there's this tendency to either argue, and we see so much of that on television, the shouting matches.
That's not true.
That kind of thing, exactly. Back and forth, and then where's the understanding in that? But this whole, and I love, for example, just to digress for a moment, I love these old French films where you, in the south of France, where you'd see that entire family at some point in the film sitting around a wonderful meal, all ages, you know, like a little ladder going upward, and exchanging ideas back and forth across the table. That's the art of conversation. C.S. Lewis, the famous writer, had a wonderful phrase. He called it the joy of people who take each other seriously. That's what it's all about.
Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHz Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.